Callaghan, and I'm chairman of the Southam Heritage Collection. I've been associated with the collection since its founding back in 2005-2006, and I'm recording this video towards the end of 2020, which means that the Heritage Collection has been in existence for 14 years now. The Heritage Collection dates back to the dark days of World War II, when Jack Cardall, who was the local coal overseer, decided to write some pamphlets on local history. These pamphlets proved very popular, and as a result, many local people started giving Jack items and papers relating to the history of the town, and so the collection was born. Jack Cardall and his second wife Renee continued to build the collection from then on. In 2005-06, a group of local people got together with the objective of taking the collection into public ownership and turning it into a resource which would be of interest to and benefit for the people of Southam. Of course, that objective could not be achieved immediately, but over the past 14 years we have moved to the point where we now have both exhibition and project rooms in the centre of the town, and we can genuinely say we're starting to deliver on our founding objectives. Over the past 14 years, the collection has been housed in 3 different buildings in the town, and each time we've moved, and none of the moves have been of our own choice, we've moved nearer to the town centre, which is actually where we've wanted to be right since the very beginning. Our previous 2 homes were old buildings and had an interesting history in themselves, but now we're located in a very modern building which is only 5 or 6 years old. This new building, or rather the construction of it, has given rise to an absolutely fascinating series of discoveries, which are probably much more significant than the stories with either of our previous homes. If you will bear with me for a few minutes, I will explain what I mean. But first, let me describe some of the background to all of this. Southam has been an important market town in South Warwickshire for hundreds of years, and can trace its history back to the Domesday Book and even before that. However, like all communities in the UK, it faces constant pressure to expand as the population of the country grows and more people move into the area. And this means it is needed to update and expand various facilities. One of the biggest changes in the town centre in recent years has been the development of 75 apartments for older residents who are likely to need on-site care in their later years. This development, which also included a new library, 3 community rooms, a cafe and a police office, as well as the apartments, was quite a few years in the making, and it is now known as Tithe Place and Tithe Lodge, depending on exactly which part of it you are referring to. What I want to do in this short video is to tell you about a very interesting story about what the name or names mean and why they were chosen. Let's start with the easy bit first. Why are there 2 names, Tithe Place and Tithe Lodge? Well, the reason is simple. It is to differentiate between the living accommodation and the community space. The apartments, or living accommodation, are called Tithe Lodge, and they have their entrance on what some people would regard as the rear of the development in Little Park, which is just off Park Lane, just beyond St James's Church. The other rooms, i.e. the library, cafe, community rooms, police office and public toilets, are referred to as Tithe Place, and have their entrance on High Street, just beyond Market Hill. So 2 names for 1 building. Tithe Lodge for where the people live, and Tithe Place for the community facilities. Now, all of this development required 2 older, but still major buildings, plus 2 houses to be demolished. The major buildings were the previous library, which dates from 1969, and a substantial building called Victor Hodges House. This was a set of apartments built in 1966, which was intended as accommodation for older people, but which by the early 2000s was deemed no longer able to meet the needs of older folk. For instance, not every apartment had its own bathroom or toilet, and certainly the energy efficiency was way below what was now expected. So, the decision was taken to demolish both buildings plus 2 houses and erect a modern, fit-for-purpose building as a replacement. Now, the site of both the library and the Victor Hodges house, right in the centre of Southam, was a significant one, lying as it did just adjacent to Market Hill, right in the centre of the town. In fact, the site of both buildings had, until the 1950s, been the site of the rectory and the rectory farm. Because of the prominence of the site, part of the planning permission for the new development stipulated that various archaeological works had to be undertaken to determine if there had been anything of any significance on the site in the past. No one knew of anything, but there again, no one knew there wasn't anything, and it was a very prominent site. Not knowing anything about a site is not all unusual. In the past, before say the 1800s, relatively few records were kept, and indeed very few maps were drawn. The earliest maps covering Southam and the surrounding area relate to the estate of Lord Craven, who owned a lot of land in and around Southam, but these are as late as 1776, i.e. only about 250 years ago. And Ordnance Survey maps, which most of you will be familiar with, did not start to exist until very similar times following the Jacobite Rising in 1745. The first things done by the archaeologists who were employed to conduct the research was what is called a desk survey. Various historical records, maps and archives were consulted to see if anything could be found about the land to be redeveloped. This work was done by the Worcestershire County Council Archaeology Department, as was the subsequent on-site work. This initial work did not identify any specific area of interest, but it did conclude there was potential for deposits dating from the early medieval period and possibly even before that. So the first thing to do was to dig some trenches and see if anything of interest could be found. These first trenches were dug in what was at that time the front garden of the Victor Hodges house in Little Park. Amazingly, only 1 to 2 feet below the surface, some large stonework was found. I can remember being asked by the town mayor, Mike Gaffney, if the Heritage Collection would like to see these findings. Needless to say, we didn't need a second invitation. A colleague and I, together with Mike and the town clerk, went along one very wet November day in 2012 to look at the site. As you can see from these pictures, there had been a significant amount of rain not long before our visit, and the area was extremely wet and soggy. In fact, the ladies who went along pretty well ruined their shoes, and Mike and myself had a lot of mud to clear off ours when we eventually left the site. As you will have seen from the pictures, the trenches were quite large, but despite this, it was not possible to come to any conclusion as to exactly what the stone structures actually were. However, it was obvious that much more serious investigations would be required to determine exactly what the stonework was and see if anything else could be found. Following on from these first exciting finds, some more trenches were dug in what had been the library grounds, and some limited evidence of earlier occupation was found, but nothing quite on the scale of the initial find, even though this site was nearer to the centre of Southam. Plans were then made to do a much more extensive investigation of the area to the front of the Victor Hodges house, where the large stone structures had been found. But this had to wait until the work to demolish the Victor Hodges house and the library could be done early in 2013. Fortunately, the spring of 2013 turned out to be somewhat drier than the previous November, and this allowed the relevant buildings to be demolished and the archaeologists to move in. Following several months of hard work, an amazing picture began to develop. Not only did the archaeologists discover the foundations of a major building that had previously been unknown, but they also discovered some significant additions to the few limited findings in the Southam area dating back to the Roman period. One of these new items was a Roman coin. This has since been dated to the reign of the Emperor Constans, who reigned from AD 337 to 350, which is not too long before the end of Roman rule in Britain. Now, given that the Fosse Way, a major Roman road, is only just under 4 miles away, and the Roman encampment at Chesterton on the Fosse Way is at 5 miles, only a little further away, it is perhaps surprising that more evidence of Roman activity hasn't been found in and around Southam. In addition to the Roman coin, the archaeologists also found a number of Roman ditches, which they believe were probably related to a dip field system. In these ditches, a fair number of pottery shards, 34 in fact, were found along with several fragments of tiles, all dating from the same period. Now, this find is actually the largest single find of Roman activity in the Southam area to date. So it seems there was definitely Roman activity and maybe a settlement of some sort in or near Southam. Maybe the HS2 archaeological work currently underway will uncover yet more evidence along the same lines and allow a more complete picture to be drawn of Roman activity in Southam. We will just have to keep our fingers crossed. Now, moving on from the Roman times, the next really significant find was that the stonework discovered the previous winter was actually the foundations of a large building. Unfortunately, only about half the building's foundations could be unearthed. It may be that the remaining parts of the building were destroyed when the original Victor Hodges house was built in the 1960s, when the rules for developing sites were not nearly so rigorous as they are today, and as a result, the other evidence was destroyed when the earlier building foundations were laid. The foundations that were uncovered in 2012-2013 were perhaps spared because they were in the front garden area of the Victor Hodges house. So what do these foundations look like? Well, we have a spectacular aerial photo of them, which I will show you now. This and the following photos were taken by Adam Stanford from Aerial Cam, and we are most grateful to him for allowing us to use these photos. The top of the first picture faces towards St James's Church, and the area you can see is pretty well directly behind the current telephone exchange. You can see thick walls forming 3 sides of the building, strongly buttressed at frequent intervals, and at the top left of the picture, and a bit more difficult to see, are the remains of a paved entrance passage to the building. There would almost certainly have been further foundations for this building to the left of the picture, meaning it may have been double what we can see in size, but these were probably destroyed during earlier work on the site. No evidence was found of any floor surface within the building, apart from the entrance passage, and no evidence was found of any interior stone walls. The complete building was probably of the order of 45 metres in length, so a fair size. You may be able to see this a little bit better in this next picture, taken from the opposite direction, which also shows a stone wall at the top of the picture, which was probably part of a boundary wall associated with this building, and also, adjacent to it, the site of the Roman ditch, which I mentioned before. So what was the building, and when was it constructed? Well, as you can see in the short video clip I'll show you in a minute, the conclusion is that it was a tithe barn, and hence the names Tithe Lodge and Tithe Place, for the 2 sections of the new building erected on the site. You may well ask, what exactly is a tithe barn? It's not really a well-used word in modern times. Well, the word tithe, from the Old English teogotheon, or tenth, describes a custom dating back to Old Testament times and adopted by the Western Christian Church, whereby lay people contributed a tenth of their income for religious purposes, often under ecclesiastical or legal obligation. The money, or its equivalent in crops, farm stock, etc., was used to support the clergy, maintain churches, and assist the poor. Tithing was also a prime source of subsidy for the construction of many magnificent cathedrals across Europe. Despite serious resistance, tithing became obligatory as Christianity spread across Europe. It was enjoined by ecclesiastical law from the 6th century and enforced in Europe by secular law from the 8th century. In England, in the 10th century, payment was made obligatory under ecclesiastical penalties by Edmund I and under temporal penalties by Edgar. The practice of paying tithes started in England in the 9th century and continued to a certain extent until as recently as the 19th century, although the practice was dying out for some time before that. Money in the form of coinage, as we know it today, really did not exist in such early times. So churches would have had tithe barns where parishioners would be obliged to bring a tenth of their annual produce and donate it to the church. As many of you will probably know, the manor of Southam belonged to the Priors of Coventry since just before the Norman conquest, and so this barn would probably have been used to provide some of the support for the church, not just in Southam, but over other parts of Warwickshire. So how did the archaeologists conclude that these foundations did in fact belong to a tithe barn, given that there was no documentary evidence that one ever existed in Southam? Have a listen to this short video clip taken in the summer of 2013 after most of the on-site work had been completed.
You're looking at a building that's up to 45 metres long, because usually they're usually in the centre. Yeah. The porch is usually in the centre. Not always, but usually. So it's a quite a large building.
So what makes you think it's Tithe Barn and not Manor House? What are the differences? What are you looking for?
We're not getting any pottery whatsoever.
Right.
There's no floor tiles whatsoever. The only floor we've got is a cobbled surface in the entrance, which seems a bit simple if it's going to be a manor house. And based on other forms of other buildings, it fits to be a tithe barn. The size of it, the buttresses, the porched entranceway, and the fact that we've got the church there and the manor house down there. Well, we think we've got the manor house.
Yeah. Is it bigger than average size?
It's about average. We've got some measurements down. I'll show you in a minute. There are bigger and there are smaller. It's a good size building. The other reason we probably don't think it's a manor house is because it just looks like one long building. We might expect more add-ons if it had been a manor house around for a long time, whereas a barn might not change so much.
Yes, on the assumption the other one was built in 16th century.
Yes, yeah.
Today, or rather back in 2013, the only thing one could see of the tithe barn was some of the foundations. So what did a tithe barn actually look like? Let's have a look at two examples. The first is a picture of a tithe barn which is still standing at Great Coxwell in Farringdon, Oxfordshire, which is looked after by the National Trust. This barn dates from a similar period as the Southam tithe barn. As you can see from the picture, the barn is a major building. The one here in Southam, you'll remember hearing the archaeologists say, was of the order of 45 metres or 150 feet long and about 10 to 11 metres or 35 feet wide. Inside the barn, it would probably have been subdivided into a number of sections for holding different produce or animals using timber structures which have long since disappeared. Material from the site suggests that the Southam barn probably dates from the 13th and 14th centuries, although there is one piece of evidence, which I'll show you in a minute, which indicates that at least parts of it may have been still standing several hundred years later. Southam Church, St James's, dates from the 14th century, although there may well have been a church on the same or a nearby site sometime before that. It wasn't unusual for stone-built churches to replace earlier wooden structures. In addition, I also have a model of a Tithe Barn produced by Ken Bonham, which you can see here. This model was made for one of our exhibitions and shows the possible shape of the Tithe Barn together with some of the internal structures and gives a good idea of how it might have looked in all those years. You see here the entrance passageway, which would have been paved in our example, and you see an example of both a tiled roof and a thatched roof. The Southam Barn actually had a tiled roof, like this one here. And the exact structure of the roof, timbers, we don't know anything about. But if you take a look at Ken's website, which is www.greatbarns.org.uk, there are lots of pictures there which describe the various types of barns and tell you a huge amount about them. It's well worth a visit if you're interested in these structures. Okay, so what about the evidence I mentioned a short while ago indicating that the barn was perhaps still standing in the 1700s? Well, following on from the discovery of the foundations, we at the Heritage Collection redoubled our efforts to see if there wasn't anything in our records relating to the barn. And to our delight, we came up with one piece of evidence. This is dated 1756 and comes from a transcription of the church records made by one of Southam's rectors, where the burial of a certain John Hartop, described as a weaver, is recorded following his death when his thigh was broken by the door of the Tithe Barn falling on him in high winds. He was buried in a woolen shroud, and the cost of the funeral was 2 shillings, or 10 pence in today's money, but probably worth very much more back in 1756. And that is it. Nothing else has ever been found to date that mentions a Tithe Barn in Southam, but the foundations almost unquestionably prove that there was such a barn and that it existed for many years, perhaps even 400 years or more, before it finally either fell to pieces or its stonework was used to form the basis of other buildings in the town, not long before the estate maps of Lord Craven's estate were drawn up in 1776. You might say, perhaps, that maybe our ancestors were into recycling, especially if it saved them lots of hard work or money. Maybe the door falling on poor John Hartop was the final straw and precipitated the dismantling of the remains of the building. We will probably never know, but at least, due to the development on the site, we do now know an awful lot more about the ancient history of Southam. We know the Romans spent time in the area, cultivating the land, and we know how Southam townspeople contributed to the good of Warwickshire by paying tithes to the Coventry priors, probably for many, many years. If you do happen to know anything more relating to the Tithe Barn or Roman activity in the Southern area, we at the Heritage Collection would be very interested to hear from you. You can always contact us via email at southamheritage@hotmail.com or visit our website, which is www.southamheritage.org, or drop in to our exhibition room in Tithe Place whenever we are open. I hope you'll agree with me. This is a really fascinating story which opens up whole new areas of Southam's development. Thank you very much for watching.